In terms of understanding some of the reforms that were brought about by Honorable Mpuuga in terms of the electoral landscape, Mpuuga's reform aimed to transform Uganda's electoral system in terms of addressing key challenges. And the proposed referendum and other provisions amendment bill could actually save resources in terms of holding referendums, uh, concurrently with presidential and other, government council elections. Then, therefore, there's a need to do what they call constitutional amendments, which include presidential term limits, for example, regional vote requirements, transfer of executive power, deputizing the presidents in terms of election, and then challenging presidential elections, for example, and then resignation of parliamentary members. Now, these are some of the things that were being uh, cooked, if you like, by the Mpuuga debate. And in terms of parliamentary elections reforms, the suggesting proportional representation, district and even city representation, and even women representatives in terms of that aspect, which is really, really good. Okay, I would give it to him in terms of that. And therefore, the success would hinge on things like political will. Do we have the political will to engage? Do we have public engagement, for example? Do we have institutional capacity, for example, to engage in terms of the things? So we need to compare, for example, Uganda's reforms to successful examples, like countries like like South Africa, for example, Rwanda, Germany, on the other hand, and also Kenya, that has actually devolved in terms of governance. Now, in terms of challenges, it's also important. Uganda has substantive challenges that is likely to face, even as they engage in some of the things. We're talking about things like entrenched patronage, for example, electoral, commission independence, and political party strength, and also constitutional amendments. And these are things that we need to think about. So, as I conclude, in terms of the things that I want us to talk about today, we need to understand things like alternative approaches. What approaches do we have? We could have gradual reforms rather than hurriedly, engaging, inclusive dialogue, for example, capacity building, and even regional cooperation. So the argument here is that while Mpuuga's reforms show promise in terms of addressing potential challenges and fostering collaborations in terms of the things, it becomes extremely crucial. Now, let me first of all delve a little bit deeper in terms of his reforms, what I argue and tag as Mpuuga's reforms. The Referendum and Other Provisions Amendment Bill is intended to amend the Referendum and Other Provisions Act to enable the Electoral Commission to hold referendums on the same day as presidential, parliamentary, even local government council elections in terms of saving resources. Let's give it to him. Not so. And then in terms of constitutional amendments, we could argue in terms of presidential term limits, establishing a two-term limit for president, preventing indefinite rule or indefinite rule, as it were. Let's give it to him as well. We could also argue in terms of regional vote requirement, in terms of requiring presidential candidates to obtain 25% of votes in each region, in terms of promoting national unity. That's a dicey one, not so. We could also argue in terms of transfer of executive power, where it clarifies in terms of the process of transitioning power after presidential term, expires. That's a good one as well. In terms of deputy president, replacing the so-called vice president with a deputy president elected as a running mate, enhancing accountability. That's another beautiful one, I think. And in terms of challenging presidential elections, allowing registered voters to challenge presidential elections upon the depositing security for costs, as it were. That's a dicey one. And in terms of resignation of parliamentary members, for example, forces MPs to appoint who appointed cabinet members to resign their parliamentary seats. That's another dicey one. And in terms of, although good, I would argue, and then in terms of minority leader requiring a person with the second highest number of votes in the presidential election to become the minority leader in the body, if you like. And then in terms of parliamentary elections, you could argue in terms of proportional representation, we could allocate 50 seats to parties based on proportional representation, and that's something they're arguing. And then district and city representation in terms of ensuring equal representation across the regions, we could give that to them as well. And then in terms of women representatives, in terms of guaranteeing women voices in parliament, no doubt, almost similar to affirmative action, I would argue. And then in terms of success factors, if you argue in terms of the probability of success in terms of these, the question is, do we have, as a country, do we have political will to carry out or even support or even corroborate these crucial aspects. Number two, are we willing to engage the public in terms of meaningful citizenship participation and in terms of education and reforms? Number three, do we have institutional capacity strengthening in terms of the Electoral Commission and even parliamentary processes? That is something also we need to look at as well. And then also we could argue in terms of some examples. If we were to borrow examples, successful examples, we could argue, for example, Germany's proportionate representation, which promotes diverse representation and even coalition building. You could argue in terms of South Africa's electoral system, which maintains stability and representation for minority groups. You could also look at it in terms of maybe Rwanda's gender quota, which achieves significant female representation or to the tune of about 61% of MPs. And then if you argue in terms of Kenya, in terms of devolved governance, which promotes decentralization and local decision making. The challenges that we have as a country, perhaps in terms of this particular mpuuga issue, is entrenched patronage. Uganda's political system is characterized by a lot of patronage, and that's another challenge that we need to look at. And also, the Electoral Commission independence, the EC autonomy is extremely crucial, and that has to come out very strongly. And then the argument of political party strength. Weak opposition parties hinder effective representation, and that's another challenge that we have as a country. And then we could also argue in terms of what they call constitutional amendments. Multiple amendments have actually consolidated power. No doubt that every now and then we have these amendments that come, at the whim of certain individuals. What some of the alternative approaches we could argue in terms of gradual reforms, implementing incremental changes. For example, we could argue in terms of inclusive dialogue, engaging diverse stakeholdership, and then capacity building, invest in electoral commission training and also voter education, and then regional cooperation in terms of learning from successful examples and collaboration and also relating with them. So for you to comprehend that, it's important to come out with a very strong word of patronage. Patronage basically would refer to the practice of a powerful individual or a group of persons providing favors or support or even resources to the less powerful individuals or groups of the client, and in exchange for loyalty allegiance in terms of the services. And it often involves, for example, appointing loyal supporters to key positions, distributing government resources or jobs to resources to particular allies, providing financial support or benefits to loyal constituents, or even influencing decisions of policies to benefit particular supporters. Not so. And patronage can actually be clientistic in a way, in the sense that it focuses on individual relationships between patrons and even the clients, and that is something that you need to look out for. Patronage can also be patronage based in terms of institutionalized systems of patronage, in terms of such as political machines, for example. And the effects of patronage definitely would result into things like undermining meritocracy and also accountability, and then fostering corruption and nepotism, for example, limiting access to resources and opportunities for non-loyalists, and also distorting political decisions, for example. You could also argue in terms of the different types of patronage. You could argue in terms of electoral patronage, where trading votes for benefits, for example, and then administrative patronage in terms of controlling government appointments and even contracts, and then legislative patronage in terms of influencing policy and even legislation. And examples of sorts would include, for example, political machines who engage in doing mercenary work, mafia-like work to be rewarded at the end of the day, or tribal, even ethnic-based patronage in Africa, which is very common, and also party-based patronage in terms of politics as well. So, if you contextualize that with Uganda, we could argue that the ruling party has several times been accused of patronage by appointing particular loyalists in certain key position and distributing resources or even contracts to allies, as it were. And the consequence there has resulted into undermining certain democratic institutions and perpetuating inequality and also poverty, obviously, and also limiting opportunities in terms of opposition and also dissent. How do we address some of these patronage? We need to strengthen institutions and the rule of law. We need to promote transparency and accountability. We need to encourage civic engagement and also participation. And therefore, the idea that I'm proponing that Mpuuga's desire to reform in terms of Uganda can actually be termed as a quest for democratic revitalization, aiming to address the country's entrenched patronage system and also promote inclusive representation. The desire is rooted obviously in the principles of democratic governance, where power is distributed equitably and citizens have actually genuine voice in terms of decision-making processes. And please understand that even as we engage in these, there are certain key underpinnings that we need to look out for. Representative democracy, Mpuuga's proposals should emphasize proportional representation, ensuring diverse voices are heard in Parliament, and also aspects of accountability. Of course, the argument of term limits and electoral reforms seeks to prevent authoritarianism and also promote transparency. And then the aspect of equity, where measures like gender quotas and regional representation aim to address historical inequalities, as it were. And so that's super important for us. And in terms of conclusion, I would argue and say that the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have little. That was said by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And that reflects what Mpuuga's focus on equality or equity is concerned. And then the argument that democracy is not a form of government, it is a way of life. That was said by Mary Parker as well, in terms of highlighting Mpuuga's emphasis on democratic revitalization, if you like. In terms of challenges and opportunities, I would argue and say that while Mpuuga's reforms faces significant challenges, including Uganda's entrenched patronage system and also political resistance from vested interests, they also present opportunities and democratic renewals and even inclusive growth. And that is something that is important. God bless you, and thank you once again.